My boss demoted me because of budget cuts, then blamed me when profits tanked after I left. The email arrived at 11:53 p.m. on a Friday, which should have been my first clue that something was catastrophically wrong. Subject line: urgent. Litigation. Hold notice. Preserve all documents. I was standing in my kitchen, halfway through a beer, when my phone lit up with the notification from our company's legal department. The sender was Patricia Vaughn, senior counsel at Meridian Solutions, and the message was clear. Do not delete, modify, or destroy any emails, texts, or documents related to the Southwest Regional accounts. My accounts. The ones I'd built from nothing over 6 years. The ones I no longer managed because 3 months earlier, my boss had stripped them away and handed them to his nephew. I read it twice, then a third time, my pulse hammering in my ears. The beer went flat in my hand as I scrolled through the legalese, looking for context that wasn't there. Why was I being named in a litigation hold? What litigation? I hadn't worked those accounts since August, when David Kessler, my director, and the man I'd trusted for half a decade, had called me into his office and delivered the news with all the warmth of a parking ticket. Budget restructuring, he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. We need to consolidate responsibilities. You'll transition to a support role, and Ian will take over your portfolio. Ian being Ian Kessler, David's 26-year-old nephew, who'd joined the company 8 months prior with a marketing degree and 0 sales experience. I'd gone home that night and told my wife, Lauren, that it was temporary. A rough patch. The company was tightening belts across departments, and I'd been there long enough to weather the storm. She'd looked at me with those dark eyes that saw through every lie I told myself and asked if I'd started looking for other jobs yet. I hadn't. Not then. I still believed loyalty meant something, that 6 years of hitting quota, of building relationships, of turning a failing territory into the second highest revenue generator in the company would count for more than nepotism. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. The backstory matters because it explains why, at 11:54 p.m. on that Friday, I wasn't just confused, I was terrified. 3 months earlier, I'd been managing 8 high-value accounts across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California, worth roughly $4.2 million in annual recurring revenue. I knew every procurement officer, every IT director, every decision-maker who signed off on our enterprise software contracts. I'd spent years cultivating those relationships, learning their pain points, anticipating their needs before they articulated them. When David told me I was being reassigned, he'd framed it as a lateral move. Same salary, different responsibilities. I'd be supporting the sales team with proposal development and technical documentation. It was humiliating, but I'd swallowed it because Lauren was pregnant with our second kid, and our mortgage didn't care about my pride. What David didn't say, what I only learned later through forwarded emails and late-night phone calls from former colleagues, was that Ian had been lobbying for my territory since the day he started. David's sister, Ian's mother, sat on Meridian's board of directors. That connection had greased Ian's entry into the company, landing him a business development role that should have required 5 years of experience minimum. Instead, he'd spent 8 months shadowing various account managers, sitting in on client calls, and presumably taking notes on how to do the job he'd eventually steal from me. When budget cuts became the official narrative in August, it was convenient cover for what was really happening. David was handing his nephew a $4.2 million territory on a silver platter, and I was the collateral damage. I'd tried to be professional about the transition. I really had. I'd spent 2 weeks in September walking Ian through every account, introducing him to key contacts, explaining the nuances of contracts that were up for renewal. He'd nodded along, taking notes on a tablet, asking questions that suggested he was either very strategic or completely lost. Looking back, it was the latter. During one handoff meeting with Gregory Dawson, the IT director at Nevada Tech Solutions, our largest account at $880,000 annually, Ian had interrupted my presentation to suggest they'd see better ROI by switching to a competitor's platform. Gregory had gone silent on the call, and I'd had to spend 15 minutes walking that comment back, explaining that Ian was new and still learning our value proposition. Gregory had been polite, but I'd seen the doubt creep into his expression. By October, the cracks were showing. I was no longer on the account emails, but I still had friends in sales operations who'd forward me things they thought I should see. Client satisfaction scores for the Southwest region had dropped 18 points. 2 accounts had submitted formal complaints about response times. Nevada Tech Solutions had delayed their contract renewal, citing concerns about account management continuity. I'd wanted to say something, to warn David that Ian was in over his head, but what was the point? I was the guy who'd been demoted. Anything I said would sound like sour grapes, like a bitter employee trying to undermine his replacement. So I kept my head down, worked on proposals that would never carry my name, and waited for the quarterly numbers to tell the story I couldn't. The litigation hold email changed everything. I forwarded it to my personal account, then took a screenshot for good measure. At 12:08 a.m., I emailed Patricia Vaughn directly. Received your notice. Can you provide context on the nature of the investigation? Professional, neutral, non-defensive. I knew better than to panic in writing. My phone rang 6 minutes later. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, stepping out onto our back patio so I wouldn't wake Lauren. The voice on the other end was male, controlled, and carried the kind of authority that made my stomach drop before he even introduced himself. Is this Nathan Reeves? He asked. I confirmed, and he continued without pause. My name is Richard Frost. I'm an investigator with Morrison & Associates, retained by Meridian Solutions to look into allegations of financial impropriety related to the Southwest Regional accounts. I need to ask you some questions about your departure from that role and the status of several client contracts when you transitioned responsibilities in August. The world tilted slightly. Financial impropriety. Client contracts. I gripped the patio railing, forcing myself to breathe normally. I transitioned those accounts per company directive, I said carefully. Everything was documented. I have emails, handoff notes, client meeting summaries. What specifically are you investigating? There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. Mr. Reeves, are you aware that 3 major accounts in your former territory have terminated their contracts with Meridian Solutions in the past 6 weeks? I wasn't. I'd heard about the satisfaction scores, the delays, but not terminations. No, I said. I've been out of the loop since August. Who terminated? Another pause. Nevada Tech Solutions, Desert Infrastructure Group, and Pinnacle Healthcare Systems. Combined annual value of approximately $2.1 million. All 3 cited poor account management and unmet service commitments as primary reasons for cancellation. My mind raced. Those were my accounts. I'd built those relationships from cold calls. Gregory Dawson at Nevada Tech had been my first major close, back when I was 29 and terrified of failing. I'd known his kids' names, his golf schedule, his favorite bourbon. Desert Infrastructure had taken me 18 months to land, countless presentations, a pricing structure I'd negotiated personally with finance. Pinnacle had been a referral from Nevada Tech, a testament to the trust I'd built. And now, they were gone. What does this have to do with financial impropriety? I asked, though I was starting to understand. Richard Frost's voice tightened with something that might have been sympathy. Your former director, David Kessler, has filed an internal complaint alleging that you sabotaged the account transitions. He claims you deliberately withheld critical information from Ian Kessler during the handoff, damaged client relationships through negative commentary about company changes, and may have actively encouraged clients to terminate their contracts as retaliation for your demotion. I actually laughed. It was a short, bitter sound that surprised me. That's insane, I said. I spent 2 weeks doing nothing but handoff work. I introduced Ian to every client personally. I documented everything in the CRM system. If he's saying I sabotaged him, he's lying to cover his own incompetence. Silence on the other end. Then, do you have evidence supporting your version of events? I thought about the emails, the meeting notes, the client introduction templates I'd created specifically for Ian's benefit. Yes, I said. Everything's documented. When do you need it? Richard gave me an email address and a deadline. Monday morning, 9 a.m. I thanked him, ended the call, and stood on the patio for a long time, watching the neighbor's security light flicker in the dark. When I finally went back inside, Lauren was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She was 7 months pregnant, and her face had that particular expression that meant she'd already figured out something was wrong. Who called? She asked. I told her everything, the email, the investigator, David's allegations. She listened without interrupting, her hand resting on her belly, and when I finished, she closed the laptop with a decisive click. You need a lawyer, she said. Not just HR, not just an investigator. A lawyer. Because if they're accusing you of sabotage, they're building a case to fire you for cause, which means no severance, no unemployment, and probably a fight over your stock options. She was right, of course. Lauren worked in compliance at a pharmaceutical company. She understood how these things worked. By 1:30 a.m., we'd drafted an email to an employment attorney one of her colleagues had recommended. By 2 a.m., I was at my desk, pulling every email, every calendar invite, every CRM entry related to the Southwest accounts. The documentation was exhaustive. I'd been meticulous during the transition, partly because I'm wired that way, and partly because I'd sensed even then that David might try to make me the scapegoat if things went sideways. What I hadn't anticipated was just how badly Ian would fail, or how willing David would be to sacrifice me to protect his nephew. The emails painted a damning picture, just not of me. On August 15th, I'd sent Ian a 32-page transition document outlining every active contract, renewal timeline, key contacts, and ongoing negotiations. I'd included notes on client personalities, communication preferences, and potential concerns. On August 19th, I'd scheduled a joint call with Nevada Tech Solutions to introduce Ian and ensure continuity. During that call, Ian had been quiet, letting me handle most of the conversation. Gregory Dawson had asked pointed questions about why the account manager was changing, and I'd stuck to the script. Company restructuring, Ian's bringing fresh perspective, I'll still be available for support. Gregory had been polite, but clearly skeptical. The trouble started in September. I found an email chain where Gregory had reached out to me directly, bypassing Ian entirely, to ask about a contract amendment we'd discussed in July. I'd forwarded his request to Ian with detailed notes on how to handle it, then CC'd David to keep everything transparent. Ian's response had come 3 days later, not to Gregory, but to me, asking what a contract amendment was and whether it required legal approval. I'd walked him through the process, but by then, Gregory had sent a follow-up email expressing frustration with the delay. Ian had responded to that email with a message that made me physically wince when I read it. "Hi, Gregory, sorry for the wait. I'm still getting up to speed on these legacy issues. Maybe we can schedule a call next week to discuss?" Legacy issues. He'd called a routine contract amendment that I'd negotiated and maintained for 3 years a legacy issue, as if it were some antiquated problem he'd inherited rather than a simple administrative task. I found another email from late September where Desert Infrastructure Group had asked for a quarterly business review, something I'd conducted with them religiously every 90 days. Ian had replied saying he'd circle back after he finished onboarding. The client had responded tersely. "We've been working with Meridian for 2 years. This isn't onboarding, this is account management. We expect the same level of service we received from Nathan." Ian had never scheduled that review. I knew because the client had emailed me directly in early October, asking if I could facilitate the meeting since Ian seems overwhelmed. I'd forwarded that email to David, explaining that the client was requesting my involvement and asking how he wanted me to proceed. David's response had been brief. "Ian is the account owner. Direct all client inquiries to him." By 4 a.m., I'd compiled a 60-page document with email chains, CRM screenshots, and time-stamped records showing exactly when and how I'd transitioned each account. I'd also found something else. An email from David to Ian dated September 28th, well after my demotion, where David had written, "Don't worry about Nevada Tech. Their contract is up in November anyway. If they don't renew, we'll blame it on Nathan's handoff and move on." I read that line 5 times, my hands shaking with a rage I hadn't felt in years. David hadn't just been covering for Ian's failures. He'd been planning to blame me for them before they'd even happened. I sent everything to Richard Frost at 6 a.m., with a cover email summarizing the evidence and offering to provide testimony or additional documentation as needed. Then I sent a copy to the employment attorney Lauren had contacted, along with a note. "I think I'm going to need you sooner rather than later." I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk, watching the sun come up, thinking about Gregory Dawson and the dozens of other clients I'd worked with over 6 years. They hadn't terminated their contracts because I'd sabotaged Ian. They'd terminated because Ian was incompetent, and David had been too arrogant or too blind to see it. Monday morning, I showed up at the office at 7:30 a.m., earlier than usual. I wanted to be there before David, before the rumors started spreading, before whatever was coming next hit. The Meridian Solutions headquarters occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix, and my cubicle, because yes, I'd gone from an office to a cubicle during the restructuring, was on the 2nd floor, tucked into a corner near the break room. I logged into my computer and checked my email. There were 2 new messages. The first was from HR, requesting a meeting at 10 a.m. The second was from Patricia Vaughn, the lawyer who'd sent the litigation hold notice, asking me to call her as soon as I arrived. I called Patricia first. She answered on the second ring, and her tone was brisk but not hostile. "Nathan, thank you for responding so quickly. I've reviewed the materials you sent to Richard Frost over the weekend. I want to confirm that you're claiming the account transitions were conducted properly and that you have documentation supporting that claim." I confirmed, keeping my voice steady. "I do. Everything I sent to Richard is accurate and complete. If David Kessler is alleging that I sabotaged Ian, he's lying." There was a pause. Then Patricia said something that made my stomach clench. "Nathan, I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. If the company pursues termination for cause based on David's allegations, you'll be facing significant professional consequences. I'm obligated to investigate all claims thoroughly, and right now, you're being accused of deliberate misconduct that cost the company over $2 million in revenue." "I understand," I said. "And I'm telling you that the evidence proves otherwise. Ian failed because he's unqualified, and David is trying to protect him by making me the scapegoat. If you look at the CRM logs, the email chains, the client feedback, it's all there." Patricia made a non-committal sound. "We'll review everything. In the meantime, please attend the meeting with HR at 10. And Nathan, don't discuss this with anyone else in the company. The investigation is confidential." She hung up before I could respond. The HR meeting was worse than I'd anticipated. Diane Fletcher, the VP of Human Resources, sat across from me with a folder thick enough to be a manuscript. Next to her was Gerald Tang, a senior HR business partner I'd never met before, and Patricia Vaughn, who didn't make eye contact when I entered the room. Diane opened the folder and slid a stapled document across the table. "Nathan, we're here to discuss serious allegations regarding your conduct during the transition of the Southwest Regional accounts. David Kessler has submitted a formal complaint claiming that you engaged in deliberate sabotage, including withholding information, damaging client relationships, and encouraging clients to terminate contracts. We take these allegations very seriously." I picked up the document and scanned it. David's statement was 4 pages long, single-spaced, and full of lies so brazen they would have been impressive if they weren't aimed at destroying my career. He claimed I'd refused to provide Ian with access to client files. He claimed I'd told Gregory Dawson that Ian was incompetent and not to be trusted. He claimed I'd deliberately scheduled client calls during times I knew Ian couldn't attend, then badmouthed him in follow-up emails. Every word was fiction. "This is completely false," I said, keeping my voice level. I have documentation proving that I provided Ian with comprehensive handoff materials, introduced him to every client personally, and made myself available for questions throughout the transition. If clients lost confidence in Ian, it's because of his performance, not my sabotage. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. Diane exchanged a glance with Patricia. We've reviewed the materials you submitted to the investigation team, she said carefully. While your documentation does show a formal transition process, David's complaint raises questions about your conduct outside of documented channels. He claims you had private conversations with clients where you undermined Ian's credibility. I felt the trap closing. Private conversations. How do you prove what you didn't say in undocumented phone calls? I never undermined Ian, I said. If clients called me after the transition, I referred them back to Ian. I have emails proving that. Diane nodded slowly. We'll consider all evidence as part of the investigation. However, given the severity of the allegations and the financial impact on the company, we're placing you on paid administrative leave effective immediately. You'll need to surrender your laptop and access badge before you leave today. The words hit like a physical blow. Administrative leave. The professional equivalent of being sent to your room while the adults decided your fate. I'd been at Meridian for 6 years, and now I was being escorted out like a criminal. How long? I managed to ask. Gerald Tang, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. The investigation will take approximately 2 weeks. We'll contact you when we have a decision. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of sitting at home, knowing that David and Ian were spinning their narrative, knowing that my reputation was being shredded in conference rooms I couldn't access. I wanted to argue, to demand they look at the evidence right now, but Lauren's voice echoed in my head. Get a lawyer, don't make it worse. I nodded stiffly, signed the administrative leave paperwork, and walked out of the building at 10:52 a.m. with a box containing the contents of my cubicle and a burning conviction that I wasn't going down without a fight. The employment attorney's name was Michael Brennan, and he practiced out of a modest office in Tempe. I met with him on the same afternoon, bringing printed copies of every email, every CRM log, every piece of evidence I'd compiled. Michael was in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm, measured demeanor that suggested he'd seen this exact scenario play out 100 times before. He listened to my story without interrupting, took notes in a leather-bound notebook, and asked precise questions about timelines and documentation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Nathan, you've done an excellent job preserving evidence. That's going to be critical. But I need you to understand something. Companies like Meridian have significant resources, and they're very good at protecting themselves. If they've already decided to terminate you for cause, they'll find a way to justify it, even if the evidence doesn't fully support their claims. So what do? I asked. Michael smiled grimly. We fight, but we don't fight fair. We use every tool available, and we make sure that if they're going to fire you, they pay for it. First, I'm going to send a letter to Meridian's legal department outlining your version of events and making it clear that any termination will be met with immediate legal action. Second, I want you to start documenting everything related to Ian's performance that you can verify independently. Client complaints, contract terminations, anything public-facing. Third, we're going to prepare a wrongful termination claim, including allegations of nepotism and retaliation for your objections to Ian's appointment. I hadn't objected to Ian's appointment, at least not formally. I said as much, and Michael shrugged. Doesn't matter. The moment David demoted you to make room for his nephew, he created a hostile work environment. The fact that they're now blaming you for Ian's failures, that's retaliation. We can argue that in court. Over the next week, I did exactly what Michael advised. I reached out to former clients, carefully, professionally, asking for their feedback on the transition. Gregory Dawson was blunt. Nathan, I tried to work with Ian. I really did. But he didn't know our systems, didn't understand our needs, and kept promising things he couldn't deliver. When he missed the deadline on that contract amendment, we lost confidence. It wasn't personal, but we couldn't afford to keep working with someone who wasn't competent. I asked if he'd be willing to provide a written statement, and he agreed. Within 3 days, I had similar statements from contacts at Desert Infrastructure and Pinnacle Healthcare. None of them mentioned me sabotaging Ian. All of them described a new account manager who was overwhelmed, unresponsive, and ultimately unable to meet their expectations. Michael incorporated those statements into a demand letter that he sent to Patricia Vaughn on the 10th day of my administrative leave. The letter was a masterpiece of controlled aggression, laying out the evidence of my proper transition work, the client statements confirming Ian's incompetence, and the legal theories supporting a wrongful termination and retaliation claim. It also included a paragraph that made me nervous when I first read it. Should Meridian Solutions proceed with termination based on the false allegations made by Mr. Kessler, my client will have no choice but to pursue all available legal remedies, including public disclosure of the nepotistic practices that led to his demotion and the subsequent client losses. Public disclosure. Michael explained that this was leverage. Companies hated public scandals, especially ones involving board members and nepotism. If we could make David and Ian's relationship a liability, Meridian might decide it was easier to settle than to fight. 2 days later, Patricia Vaughn called Michael's office and requested a meeting. I wasn't invited, which Michael said was normal. They wanted to gauge how serious we were without committing to anything on the record. Michael went alone, and when he returned 3 hours later, he looked cautiously optimistic. "They're scared," he said. "Not of the wrongful termination claim. That's always a risk they can calculate. They're scared of the board finding out that David Kessler tanked a $2 million portfolio to help his nephew and then tried to blame you for it. Patricia spent half the meeting asking me not to name Ian's mother in any filings." I felt a surge of vindication. "So what happens now?" Michael leaned forward. "Now we negotiate. They'll offer you a settlement, probably a few months' salary, a neutral reference, and a confidentiality agreement. You'll walk away, they'll fire Ian quietly, and David will probably get a slap on the wrist. It's not perfect justice, but it's closure." I thought about that for a long moment. A settlement meant I'd never have to set foot in Meridian again, never have to face David across a conference table, never have to explain to future employers why I'd been fired for cause. It meant financial security while I looked for a new job, and it meant Lauren and I wouldn't have to spend the next year embroiled in litigation. But it also meant David would get away with it. He'd demoted me to advance his nephew, blamed me when it failed, and now he'd write me a check and move on. The injustice of it burned. "What if I don't want to settle?" I asked. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Then we go to court." "But Nathan, you need to understand what that means. Litigation is expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally exhausting. Even if you win, it could take 2 years, and you'll spend that entire time known as the guy who sued his former employer. Is that really what you want?" I went home and talked to Lauren. She was sitting on the couch, our daughter Lily playing on the floor nearby, and I laid out the options as clearly as I could. "Michael thinks we can get a good settlement," I said. "Enough to cover us for 6 months while I find something new. But it means letting David off the hook." Lauren looked at me with those dark, perceptive eyes. "What do you want?" she asked. I realized I didn't know. I wanted David to face consequences. I wanted Ian to admit he'd been in over his head. I wanted Gregory Dawson and the other clients to know that I hadn't betrayed them. But wanting those things didn't make them possible. "I want to be done with this," I said finally. "I want to move on." Lauren nodded. "Then take the settlement. Sometimes winning means knowing when to walk away." We settled 3 weeks later for 5 months' salary, a neutral reference letter signed by Patricia Vaughn, and a mutual non-disparagement agreement. I signed the papers in Michael's office, feeling equal parts relief and resignation. The money would carry us through Lauren's maternity leave and my job search. The reference letter would keep my employment history clean. The non-disparagement clause meant I couldn't publicly call David a liar and a nepotist, but it also meant he couldn't badmouth me to industry contacts. It was, as Michael had promised, closure, but it wasn't justice, or so I thought. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until 4 months later, was that my departure had started a chain reaction that would bring David's entire world crashing down. The first domino fell in early December, when the quarterly earnings call revealed that the Southwest regional accounts had lost an additional $1.3 million in revenue. Investors weren't happy. The stock price dropped 8% in 2 days. The board of directors demanded an explanation, and David's response, that the losses were due to transition issues caused by my departure, didn't satisfy them. They wanted details. They wanted documentation. They wanted to know why a single account manager's exit had cratered an entire region. That's when someone, I still don't know who, though I suspect it was Richard Frost, leaked the internal investigation files to a board member. Not the sanitized version Patricia Vaughn had presented, but the full record, including David's email about blaming me if Nevada Tech didn't renew, the client statements confirming Ian's incompetence, and the fact that Meridian had paid me a settlement to avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. The board member, a woman named Carolyn Hughes who'd made her fortune in private equity, was apparently furious. She'd been kept in the dark about the nepotism, the client losses, and the legal exposure. She demanded David's resignation in a closed-door meeting just before Christmas. David refused. He argued that he'd acted in the company's best interests, that the transition had been mishandled but wasn't his fault, that Ian deserved a chance to prove himself. Carolyn didn't budge. She told him that if he didn't resign, she'd call a special board meeting and present the full investigative file, including the detail that Ian's mother, David's sister, sat on the board and had never disclosed the conflict of interest. David resigned on December 23rd. The company issued a terse press release citing strategic differences. Ian was quietly let go 2 weeks later, his tenure at Meridian lasting exactly 14 months. I learned all of this from Amanda Silverman, one of my former colleagues in sales operations, who'd stayed in touch despite the non-disparagement agreement. We met for coffee in late January, and she filled me in on everything that had happened after I left. "The place is a disaster," she said, stirring her latte absently. After David left, they brought in an external consultant to audit the Southwest region. The consultant's report was scathing, said the client losses were entirely preventable, and blamed David's decision to replace an experienced account manager with an unqualified nepotism hire. Ian's name was in the report 11 times, always in the context of failures. David's was in there 34 times. It's circulating internally now, and everyone knows what really happened. "Does David know?" I asked. Amanda smiled. "Oh, he knows. He tried to get a job at one of our competitors, but the hiring manager called someone here for a back-channel reference. Guess what they heard? I could guess. The story of how David Kessler had destroyed a $2 million portfolio to help his nephew, then tried to scapegoat the guy he'd demoted. That story would follow David for the rest of his career. What about Ian? I asked. Amanda shrugged. Last I heard, he's working for his mom's consulting firm, probably the only place that would hire him after this. We talked for another hour, catching up on office gossip and industry news, and when we parted ways, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. I'd found a new job in early January, managing key accounts for a smaller competitor. The pay was slightly better, the culture was healthier, and nobody asked me why I'd left Meridian beyond the standard interview questions. My references checked out, Patricia's letter was as neutral as promised, and the hiring manager seemed more interested in my track record than my last employment drama. I started on a Monday, 2 weeks before my second daughter was born, and threw myself into building relationships with my new clients. It felt good to be doing the work I loved again, without the shadow of David's betrayal hanging over me. But the story wasn't quite over. In March, I got a LinkedIn message from Gregory Dawson. Nathan, hope you're doing well. I heard you landed at Cordova Systems. Congrats, they're lucky to have you. I wanted to reach out because we're reviewing our software vendors again, and frankly, Meridian hasn't improved since you left. Would Cordova be interested in competing for our business? I stared at the message for a long time, then forwarded it to my new boss with a note. Former client from my Meridian days. We should definitely pursue this. 3 months later, Cordova Systems signed Nevada Tech Solutions to a 3-year contract worth $920,000 annually. Gregory insisted on working with me personally, and during our first quarterly business review, he mentioned offhandedly that Meridian had tried to win the account back with a steep discount. I told them no, he said. After what happened with Ian, I don't trust their account management. You build relationships over years, not months. They should have known that. Desert Infrastructure Group followed in June, Pinnacle Healthcare in September. By the end of the year, I'd brought over $2.4 million in annual recurring revenue to Cordova, most of it from former Meridian clients who'd trusted me enough to follow. My boss, a straightforward woman named Rachel Ortiz, asked me once how I'd managed to poach so many accounts from a competitor. I didn't poach them, I said honestly. I built those relationships over 6 years, and when Meridian replaced me with someone who couldn't maintain them, the clients decided to go somewhere they'd be valued. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like Meridian made a very expensive mistake. She had no idea how expensive. The final piece of the story came in late November, almost exactly a year after my settlement. I was scrolling through industry news during lunch when I saw a headline that made me pause. Meridian Solutions reports continued revenue decline in Southwest Region, CEO, cites, transition challenges. The article was short, barely 3 paragraphs, but it confirmed what I'd suspected. The damage David and Ian had caused wasn't limited to the accounts they'd lost while I was still there. The entire regional strategy had collapsed. Morale was terrible. Client retention was down across the board, and the company was now scrambling to rebuild relationships that should never have been broken in the first place. I sent the article to Michael Brennan with a short message. Thought you'd find this interesting. He replied an hour later, justice delayed but not denied. Well done. I smiled at that. It wasn't the dramatic courtroom vindication I might have fantasized about in my angrier moments. David hadn't been publicly humiliated, and Ian hadn't issued a tearful apology. But they'd both lost their careers, their reputations, and their credibility in an industry that valued competence above connections. Meanwhile, I'd rebuilt my professional life, earned the trust of clients who'd followed me to a new company, and proven that loyalty and skill mattered more than nepotism. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was real. And sometimes, that's enough. Lauren and I were sitting on the patio one evening in early December, watching our daughters play in the yard, when she asked me if I ever thought about Meridian anymore. Sometimes, I admitted. Usually when I'm working with Gregory or one of the other clients who left. It reminds me how close I came to losing everything. My career, my reputation, my ability to provide for you and the kids. David almost destroyed me because he wanted to help Ian, and he didn't care what it cost. Lauren reached over and took my hand. But he didn't destroy you, she said. You fought back, and you won. Maybe not the way you expected, but you won. She was right. I'd won by doing the work, by building relationships that outlasted corporate politics, by being the kind of professional people wanted to work with. David and Ian had lost because they'd confused privilege with competence, and the market had punished them for it. That's the part they don't tell you about workplace betrayal. Sometimes the best revenge isn't a lawsuit or a public scandal. Sometimes it's just being good at what you do and letting your work speak louder than their lies. David blamed me when profits tanked, but the clients knew the truth. They'd worked with me for years, and they'd worked with Ian for months. They knew who'd earned their trust and who'd squandered it. When they had the chance to choose, they chose me. And that choice cost Meridian millions, cost David his career, and cost Ian his credibility. I didn't have to destroy them. They destroyed themselves. I just had to survive long enough to watch it happen. If you made it this far, you deserve to know the ending. I'm still at Cordova Systems. I was promoted to Senior Director of Strategic Accounts last spring, managing a team of 8 and overseeing $12 million in annual revenue. Gregory Dawson is still my client, still someone I consider a friend. I ran into David once, at an industry conference in Las Vegas. He looked older, thinner, and he avoided eye contact when he saw me across the lobby. I didn't approach him. There was nothing left to say. Ian, as far as I know, is still working for his mother's firm, well away from client-facing roles. And Meridian? They're still struggling to rebuild the Southwest region, still paying the price for the decision David made when he chose nepotism over experience. The market has a long memory, and so do clients. They remember who took care of them and who didn't. That's a lesson David learned too late, and one I'll never forget. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.